Welcome back to another episode of California Mortgage Bankers Association Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Prime Lending. I'm Shashank, your host, founder and CEO of InstaMortgage, and I have a very special guest on our show today. She is Amy McCoy. She's the founder and broker of My Hometown Realty Group. She's an active member of over 16 years and served as the president of West Georgia Board of Realtors. And the reason she is here is not just because of the fact that she's the founder and broker of the Realty Group, but also because she is a huge activist for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and of course, expansion of the fair housing. That incidentally happened, almost 60 years back, and the gap between the Black homeownership and white homeownership, which was there, has only widened. And those are some of the things that we will talk to Amy about. But before that, welcome to the show, Amy.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here, and thank you so much for everything that you're doing to be able to spread the word. And so thank you.
Sure. And if I were to go through all the committees that you've served just in the last 3-4 years, we'll be here talking for the next 30 minutes on that. But talk to me about some of those things. I mean, why are you involved in so many committees, especially the ones that handle fair housing? Like, for example, the most recent one, you were the 2021 Federal Fair Housing Policy Committee for NAR, that's National Association of Realtors, and similarly for multiple national level organizations like NAREB, and I mentioned I was just on a call with Lydia Pope the other day, the president, and local in Atlanta and Georgia and everywhere else. So talk to me about why so much involvement with committees like these.
Well, so as a person of color, I hate to always have to start there, but when we look at when we are getting engaged in member-led organization, sometimes when you're non-Caucasian, that seems to be you're pigeonholed into only that sector. Sure. Mm-hmm. But what I found is I wanted to use that to my advantage because there are things that I can't change about myself. I was born a woman of color. I am biracial. My father is Black, my mother is white from England. So she immigrated here when she was 14. So I get the best of both worlds. I get to see both sides of the conversation. I went to an HBCU, so I understand even from what colorism looks like. I live in Georgia. I live in the South. So I get to see holistically what it looks like from the systemic way that we're all known about. So I find that what I can't change about me, there were people once upon a time that made sure that I was included, because we're still trying to define what civil rights looks like, that I can appreciate those that led the way to make sure that I, as a woman, have a right to vote. I, as a woman, have a place a roof over my head, but also making sure, we had allies that were on the front line to make sure that Black people were able just to sit at the table in a restaurant or reasonable accommodations. So I need to be that voice for the next person that may be shut out. And when you understand what that life cycle is like, you recognize that it's a duty as an American, that we should take pride in our community as diverse as it should be, to making sure that we are including those different demographics, to have a voice at the table, because I grew up overseas in Germany. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I can say is that when you bring different cultures together, when you bring different ideologies together, you find that there is a lot of common ground, and someone may already have an experience to how to curb certain negative things from happening because they've already gone through those, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what I hope to bring to the table with all these different organizations that I'm a part of. Being a part of the National Association of Realtors Leadership Academy this year is huge. To be selected out of 1.6 million members and 20 of us be selected, that is paramount. So I want to use that platform to be able to inspire others that are like me, that have seen these glass ceilings, or not necessarily seen them, but have hit our heads on them. that there is light on the other side of that, that there is an opportunity to open those windows and move beyond that, and join in the conversation with what common ground looks like for people that have systemically stopped us from being able to participate or own homes or land or different things like that, that we've been shielded from.
Yeah, that's really important, Amy. What you just mentioned is to be able to use those platforms. So there are thankfully some platforms that do exist. And how do people of color, of women, or even immigrant, that, I mean, you have all those things, in a sense, you could say not going for you or going for you. It's the way how you look at it. And that's the way I have looked at it in my career, is that this becomes my duty to be able to have these conversations with leaders like you who are taking those bold steps. Let's go a little bit in the past before we come here and then talk about some of the things that the industry can do, that what you are working on.
Yeah.
But being in this industry for this long, and both from a real estate side, that's one side of the table, and also as a consumer or somebody who is trying to avail of a service within the real estate industry, whether it's Airbnb or buying a home or all of that, what kind of discrimination have you seen sitting on both sides of the table?
Wow. So as a woman of color, I can give you a book full, and it's unfortunate to have to say that, but there is a lot of unfortunate, ignorant people in this world that choose not to be able to move past their biases. And that's a reality we are always going to be faced with, right? But what I have found in the instances that I have experienced personal, so I'm going to share a story with you on a personal side, and then what I see from a business side. From a personal side, I was in New Orleans a few years ago, and I'm so glad I was at a panel at the Federal Reserve Bank here in Atlanta, because I got to meet Richard Rothstein, the author of Color of Law. I got to meet one of my sheroes, Nikitra Bailey, who is now for the National Association of Fair Housing Alliance, National Fair Housing Alliance, and there are a few others, Lisa Rice. But being able to have and share my experience, they were able to give me other information. So the situation was in 2018, a group and myself from our alumni, alma mater of Russ College, it's a HBCU. Mm-hmm. And so we went to New Orleans for the national conclave of Omega Psi Phi fraternity. And so we rented a house. It was a house that could accommodate 20 people. We only had 16 people coming, but we had to send our names and our ages ahead of time. And we did this through Airbnb. And so we arrived, some of us drove 7, some drove 9 hours in order to get there. And that was after a full day's work. So we finally arrive, and where this home is located in St. Bernard Parish is that when we arrived at the property, the agent was there to meet us. And I've stayed at a lot of Airbnbs and have always been met by the lockbox, not someone coming to meet us. But a gentleman was there, and he immediately was like, "No, I can't let you in." And we were like, "Well, why is that?" Because we've paid our money. And then he was trying to get us to pay the $4,000 all over again because, he had problems with Airbnb, but we were able to show receipt and all that. And he said, "Well, we thought we were renting to people that would be inside the home playing cards, not people that would sit on our front porch." And we were so taken back of what that meant, because we had never been given access to the home. And even to this day, we still were never given access to the property. I have no idea what the front foyer looks like. I only know the door. And then when we got on the phone with Airbnb, the owner was on the call saying, "No, we just thought we were renting to older persons." And again, we're further violating fair housing, right behind all of that. And at the time, this was because they were having check-ins at 4:30. Well, the fair housing office in that parish closes at 4:30. So here I'm immediately placing calls, trying to say, "Hey, this isn't right." And keep in mind that that time that we were there was for the National Grand Conclave for Omega Psi Phi fraternity, but also the Boule for Zeta Phi Beta. And so everything was rented out. There was no hotels. We were scrambling, trying to find accommodations for 16 people because this house accommodated all of us. So that we could have chapter meetings, all of this stuff. And so that right there, what we learned through Nikitra Bailey's, finding out is that this parish was just sued 2 years prior, which is what caused them to have to get a fair housing office in their parish to begin with. And the reason that was because prior to Hurricane Katrina and Rita, that area was more like 98% Black. And then, a lot of devastation from the hurricanes, but to come back and be more than 96% and some change white. And then they had just implemented the process that there would be no short-term rentals unless you were of blood relation. And I was like, that's very specific, very specific. God forbid if you're adopted, like I have to carry my birth certificate around with me. Like that doesn't make any sense. And then it's only related for short-term rentals. And so that was one case that unfortunately in America, one of the hardest things to prove is fair housing issues, because you only have a certain timeline, the way of record keeping, and then you have to improve intent and things like that, that it gets very hard for someone who knows, who sees, and especially feels and hears the full experience of what discrimination feels like. And when I look at these grown men that I were there with, many of them are officers in the military, firefighters, police officers. We had a college educated professor, all of this that was a part of this group, and they were just stunned. But then the same content was, we're just used to it.
Yeah.
We're just used to being treated like this. And I was like, no, absolutely not. Document, document, document. We need to make sure that we complain on this because this is not right. Because I know others are experiencing this. That ain't right. So that was just a personal story. And I could give you a couple more for business. But, before I go into that long story, it's just, there's just so much that really anyone that's experiencing discrimination or even some type of segregation, you want to know that they want to know they're being heard. Yeah. And then we're validating what they've been experiencing, whether it is that next person's intent to make them feel that way, or that, hey, maybe you are having a bad day and you just registering it all wrong, right? Yeah. Sometimes we do that. We jump the gun and say, oh, no, I'm being discriminated against. And really, we might just be on an emotional roller coaster in a different direction. But there are things when you're being discriminated against are just so outlandish that you know what it is. You're reading.
Yeah, and you're right. Sometimes proving the intent might be very hard because you may not have any document, but you are there in person experiencing it. You are grown up enough, you have seen this enough to know that you're being discriminated. You can't prove it to say an office of law or something, or to a fair housing board or something, but for sure that the reason why it's being done is because maybe you're the color of your skin. But you also brought up a very valid point, is that it's not always about race, and we need to be very clear about the fact that sometimes someone just is having a bad day, and that's something that we need to figure out where it's going with that. Why don't you tell me about maybe an experience from the business side? Because this is a forum where we share these experiences, and this was kind of it's good for the audience to know what happened to you as a person, even somebody who knows about all these laws, knows about fair housing. And we are not even talking here people who know very little about this, who have experienced very little. They would be in a very different situation. So someone like you had to go through that. But what are some of the things, even if it's just one example, because I know this is unfortunately
a very short window,
shorter window for us to discuss this, but let's talk about that as well.
So I could go into another recent story for appraisal biases.
Yeah.
I just did that on a local news channel earlier this week because of some appraisal biases. Not only did I experience, but my neighbor, when we put a white stand in, had more than $138,000 difference of potential
Whoa.
wealth being taken from them. I myself experienced close to 70,000, and then we took a biracial couple, and they had the similar experience of about 70,000. So that's one segment. But what I want to dive into as an experience is what I'm not only just facing here within my own community, but in the county I live in. Because what we recognize when we're seeing these appraisal biases is that it doesn't just affect that one homeowner, it affects the community itself, right? But one of the challenges we're finding in our community is exclusionary zoning and what that looks like. Because exclusionary zoning is how you are able to, and I'll use the example because this is what I'm advocating for with my county and my city, and it's to remove the square footage minimum. In my community, in context, we were 4th in the nation on bankruptcies. And this was after our community was redlined. And so purposely, our side of the county wind up being 4th in the nation on bankruptcies during the financial recession. We also, I believe, we're 2nd in the state in terms of foreclosures. And so when you start from there, and then you're trying to build back up, you start to look at, well, what are some of the barriers? And so after that, they imposed a ruling of that you can't build unless it's 1,800 square feet.
Wow.
And so when you look at what that looks like is now that's preventing not just low to moderate income housing, but our workforce is completely eliminated from being able to buy a new construction home. This time last year, our average home sales were 290,000. That's still reasonable for a first-time entry into to home ownership. But now we're over 400,000. And we're right outside the city of Atlanta. And so if we're at that high, trust me, city of Atlanta is even higher.
Sure.
And so the challenge with that is because when I talk to the county to see if we can build more density housing, we can't always look at single family detached residents, right? Because now you're overbuilding to where there's no green space for new innovative opportunities down the road, which dictates your transportation, it dictates the commercial aspect, it dictates how the economy will be run effectively in that community, right? So their remarks to me was, oh, but we're building townhomes. Well, sir, ma'am, I want you to think of it this perspective. I'm getting older. I don't do stairs all the time. I know I got stairs behind me, but not everybody's going to be using stairs. You need to be able to have someone who may be mature in age or is bound to a wheelchair or, has cognitive issues where they can't always lift their legs up so high. So we can't be thinking it has to go to a 2-story, it has to be a townhome. We have to have diversification. If I was born in this county and I wanted to retire in this county, unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to. I would literally have to move out of the county that might have, because I might have aged out my home because of the stairs. And now I can no longer afford to be in the home. So when we look at what discrimination looks like today, because in America, it's illegal to discriminate.
Yes. But
we incentivize to segregate. And that's the difference of how we need to look at things. Because discrimination, fair housing is not a sexy topic by any means. And people shut down when they hear it, just like they shut down when you say the word discrimination. But you also have to change the narrative to focus on, well, what is part of the discrimination? Well, what is a component of it? Segregation. We incentivize it. And that's where we have to eliminate. Because now you have gentrification, you have, that's the only time it's time to invest when we see, oh, well, we can bring white people in. We can't think that way. We really have to be inclusive of all. And we recognize that infrastructure is failing in certain communities. So when now all of a sudden we decide to reinvest in those communities, is it because now there's a demographic change, or is it because it's time to reinvest, And so I know that was a lot.
Oh, that was very powerful because you're right. It's law is one thing, which is saying that, okay, I mean, it's fair housing is a law, right? I mean, if you discriminate, that's illegal. But if indirectly you're incentivizing segregation in some way, indirectly you are incentivizing redlining in some way, you are contributing to it. I mean, that's something that, and that's, I mean, that's the reason that we started this conversation, saying that the gap between home ownership of African American population and the white population is wider now than what it was before the Fair Housing Act, which clearly shows that the fair housing has not lived to its billing, the reason
Right.
why it was structured. And so sometimes it's about, oh, if you make something illegal, it'll go away. We know for sure that's not just with housing, but with dozens of other things, they don't just go away. So sometimes just making the law by itself is not enough. So you talked a lot about some of the things that cities and counties and administration can do to do that. What are some of the other things? I know you talk about creating governing boards for HOA to create more equitable pockets of real estate. So there are multiple things, and that's why I love all the things that you're doing, Amy, is because people are usually focused on one or two things, but you have such this wide spectrum of the things that you think is contributing to it, understanding the reasons, and then working on it. Talk to us about creating governing boards for HOA for more equitable pockets of real estate.
So I'm glad you asked that question. So yes, I did serve on the Federal Finance and Policy Committee, Housing Policy Committee. I served on NAR's Diversity and Fair Housing Committee. And now under the direction of Tracy Casper, who is going to be incoming first vice president under the president, Kenny Parcell, which all takes effect in next year. So she has actually selected me to be the chair now of the Federal Finance and Housing Policy Committee, which is absolutely amazing. Because some of the things, thank you. It's probably don't want to tell everybody this, but it's one of the most exciting positions I'm a part of. Because what I saw is the impact we were able to create the last time I was on this committee. I heard there was things they were working on that nearly over a decade, and I was like, let's jump on these. And so a lot of them had to do with veterans, a lot of them had to do with FHA, because this committee cycles around federal financing. In terms of the type of loans that they go. So when I sat on that committee, we were very instrumental in being able to get the increase in VA loans. So where it used to be stagnant at $475,000, one of the things is, depending on where you're at in the country, you would have a tear down that costs more than that. So that is the government guaranteeing you that say, hey, you served your country, we're going to make sure you can become a homeowner with no down payment, right? If you qualify that part. But then we also looked at, okay, the easiest access point for home ownership is probably going to be condominiums or townhomes. But we need to make sure that HOAs give opening to FHA and VA borrowers or USDA borrowers, things like that. So we were able to get a lot of that passed through, moved it from historically where it's 10%, now it was 35%, even in non-conforming condominiums and things of that sort. We also, now that just passed in December, was instrumental in making sure that if you hold an eligibility certificate for VA, you can now buy multiple homes under your VA certificate, which before it used to be you had to sell one house and then buy another. You couldn't hold at the same time, which is a way of not allowing you to build wealth or to be able to pass it down to your family. And you shouldn't have to make that decision. You should be able to build wealth no matter what. So while I was standing at HUD, that's the first time Miss Tracy Casper saw me standing in front of the deputy director of HUD, of a VA, and asking hitting questions. So as a chair, I plan, my goals are to eliminate down payment assistance, even when it comes to FHA borrowers. Because what we learned during the last financial crisis, it didn't matter how much money you put down. It didn't matter how much equity you had in your home. If you lost your job, then it's the inability to pay. right? We learned that in the financial crisis, and we're learning that now with COVID.
Yeah, sustaining home ownership is even more important than home ownership itself. So I totally
Right.
agree.
I believe that's a way that money, that down payment, and I'm glad there's a lot of down payment systems in place. But what I also see is this is how we incentivize segregation, because it is the goal to be able to tie back into certain census tracts, but they're tied into census tracts because they were based off racial demographics. Nobody wants to say that. So in order for you to receive this money, you now have to stay in that house. And in most cases, it was nearly 10 years. So now we're going to incentivize you guys to remain in this area for the next 10 years. And if you move, refinance, or whatever, you're going to have to pay us back.
Yeah.
How does that fare? How does that make it acceptable for them to pass that equity down, or be able to say, hey, now I've had a life-changing experience with my family. Maybe I've got new children, or, in my case, during COVID, my fiance died. So I wind up having to sell my house into a new house. But what happens is, what if I had a down payment assistance that now was going to penalize me for having to move, having to make those changes? And so I don't think we need to put that burden on someone who's already paying to keep the roof over their head, as much as it would be good to invest it back in that house so that homes could be fully FHA ready, or USDA ready, or, VA ready, or whichever, to be able to maintain. That's a big thing for me. I think home ownership is so key, because that's really community stakeholdership. Our schools are funded by your tax bills, which are based on your home. We're the only country that thinks of it that way. And so, that's important to me, because these are the next generation is who's going to make sure that I can keep a roof over my head, or that we do have adequate transportation. And if we're not setting them up, or at least educating them enough to know what those differences are, then we have failed them. And so that's why DEI is so important to me, and for my community. And if that is my contribution to them, then I'm all for it.
Yeah, very interesting points, Amy, is that you keep these people in that neighborhood for 5, 7, 10 years. You tack that on with the fact that now you have appraisal biases for those specific neighborhood. You tack that on further with the fact that your schools are funded because of now they're lower valued. So you have lower income that you're getting from property tax, which means your school is not very well funded. So we are creating, and that kind of explains why we haven't seen a dip in home ownership for like a few years. It has been a pattern for a few decades, is because these are systemic issues which take years to fix. And some of the things, as you rightly mentioned, nothing of this is illegal. I mean, nobody is breaking the law, so to say, other than a few people here and there. It's you can't really put them behind bars, because they're like, I mean, we aren't doing anything which is illegal. But indirectly, all of this is contributing to the fact that we are still sitting at the kind of gap that we are sitting, like over 35% gap between Black and white home ownership is just not acceptable. And not just that, but even if you look at Hispanic home ownership sitting is still under 50%, or even Asian home ownership sitting at least about 12, 13% below the white home ownership. So I wish, Amy, really, I mean, I had a few hours, if not a few days, to discuss everything that you are doing for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Really, we at California Mortgage Bankers Association, and I'm sure every association in the country which is focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, would like to thank you for all the work that you are doing. And I hope to, get to see you soon, or hope to get you back on this podcast after you take your most exciting assignment. As you said, nobody should know, but this will be on YouTube, so the world will very soon. But thank you so much for coming on the show, Amy.
Hey, thank you very much for having me. And I appreciate the opportunity. You can always check me out at theamymccoy.com if you ever want to get to know me, relate with me, or collaborate with me. But I appreciate your time, Shashank. Thank you.
Of course. This was another episode of California Mortgage Bankers Association Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion podcast with one and only Amy McCoy. This is Shashank Shekhar, your host, founder and CEO of Insta Mortgage, and this podcast is brought to you by Prime Lending. We will see you on the next show.